My husband spent 6 months planning our divorce. He hired a lawyer in January. He opened a separate bank account in February. He started moving money in March. By April, he had already found an apartment, a 2-bedroom in the city, available June 1st. He had picked out a neighborhood. He had probably imagined what his mornings would look like without me in them. He did all of this quietly, carefully, the way you do something when you believe the other person has no idea. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, is that I found out in January, too. The same month he walked into a family law office for the first time, I was sitting at our kitchen table with a credit card statement in my hand, and I already knew, so I spent 6 months letting him think he was winning. 6 months of dinners and weekends and ordinary Tuesday evenings, while underneath the surface of our life, I was building something he would never see coming. My name doesn't matter. What matters is this. By the time Daniel sat me down at that same kitchen table on a Saturday morning in late June, with his practiced look of regret already arranged on his face, I had already won. The paperwork was ready. The attorney had been retained for months. Every number, every transfer, every account, every piece of evidence had been documented, organized, and handed to someone who knew exactly what to do with it. He thought he was about to deliver news. He was actually walking into a room where everything had already been decided. This is the story of how I found out, what I did with what I found, the 6 months in between, and what happened on that Saturday morning when he finally said the words out loud, not knowing I had been waiting for them since January. I want to start at the beginning, because the beginning matters more than people think. Daniel and I met in our junior year of college. We were 21. He was studying business, I was studying finance, and we met at a study group for an economics class neither of us particularly wanted to be in. He was funny in those days. Quick, self-deprecating, good at making a room feel lighter. I remember thinking on our third date that he was the kind of person who made things feel manageable. Whatever was hard felt slightly less hard when he was in the room. We dated for 4 years. We married at 26 in a small ceremony in my parents' backyard. My mother wore a yellow dress and cried during the vows. His father gave a toast that was too long and referenced a fishing trip 3 times. I remember laughing at that, genuinely, leaning into Daniel's shoulder at the reception table while his father talked about a trout he had caught in 1987, and that was 11 years before January. In 11 years, we built what looked, from the outside, like a good life. A house in a quiet suburb with a yard big enough for a garden I always intended to start and never did. 2 cars. A golden retriever named Biscuit, Daniel's idea, the name and the dog both, who slept at the foot of our bed every night without exception. No children. That was a conversation we'd had early, and it had been mostly his position and mostly my acceptance of it, which is something I only began to think clearly about much later. I worked as a financial analyst at a mid-sized firm. I had been promoted twice. I was, by the standards of my industry, good at my job. I am good with numbers. I notice patterns. I am comfortable with information that other people find overwhelming. I can look at a spreadsheet that would make someone else's eyes blur and see exactly what it is telling me. It is, as it turns out, a skill that saved me. Daniel worked in project management for a technology company. He had been with the same company for 7 years, which gave him a comfortable salary and a certain amount of routine that he seemed in those years to find satisfying. He traveled occasionally for work, 3 or 4 times a year, never more than a week. He had friends from college he saw a few times a year. He coached a youth soccer team for 2 seasons in our early 30s and then stopped when the schedule became inconvenient. I tell you these details not because they are dramatic, but because they are the opposite of dramatic. Our life was ordinary. I do not mean that as a criticism. I think I valued the ordinariness of it for a long time. I had grown up in a house where things were often uncertain, and I had married in part because Daniel felt like certainty. What I did not understand for most of those 11 years is that certainty and honesty are not the same thing. A person can be reliably present and still be somewhere else entirely. It started with a credit card statement. The first week of January is when I organize our filing cabinet. This is a habit I inherited from my mother, who believed that the new year should begin with order. Every year since we bought the house, I have spent the first Saturday of January going through the cabinet, throwing away what no longer matters, filing what does, making sure everything is where it should be. I had done this 10 times in that house. It was unremarkable. It was the kind of task I did while listening to something on my phone, half present, my hands moving through familiar motions, and then my hands stopped. There was a credit card statement at the back of the second drawer, tucked behind a folder of appliance warranties, which is not where credit card statements belong. The name on it was Daniel's. The billing address was ours. But I had never seen this card before. In 11 years of shared finances, in 10 years of organizing this filing cabinet, I had never seen this card. I stood there for a moment. Then I took the statement to the kitchen table and I sat down and I read every single line. The card had been opened in October. There were 4 charges. The first was a restaurant, a place I didn't recognize, in October. $62. The second and third were from the same business. A name I didn't recognize. 2 visits, one in November, one in December. The amounts were small, $140 each. The fourth was a parking charge near downtown, $8. I looked up the business name from the second and third charges on my phone. It was a law firm, Family Law. Their website listed their specialties in clean professional language: divorce, asset division, custody agreements, separation planning. I put my phone face down on the table. I put the statement face down next to it. I sat there for what I think was a very long time, though I couldn't tell you exactly how long. The refrigerator hummed. Biscuit's nails clicked on the hardwood somewhere down the hall. Winter light came through the kitchen window, thin and pale and entirely indifferent. Then I picked up the statement, walked back to the filing cabinet, and placed it exactly where I had found it. Same position, same angle. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed. Biscuit found me. He always found me. And put his heavy head on my knee and looked up at me with the complete, uncomplicated devotion that only dogs are capable of. I put my hand on his head. Then I got up, opened my laptop, and I started to plan. The first call I made was not to a divorce attorney. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters. My first instinct was not panic, and it was not confrontation. My first instinct was information. I needed to understand what I was looking at before I decided what to do with it. I called Sarah. Sarah and I had been roommates freshman year of college and had stayed close in the way that certain friendships do. Not constant contact, not weekly calls, but the kind of depth that means when something real happens, she is the first person you think of. She had become an estate attorney. She was careful, methodical, and she did not alarm easily. I told her what I had found. I told her calmly, in order, the way I would present information at work. The credit card, the law firm, the dates. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Before you do anything else, before you say a word to him, before you move any money, before you change anything, document everything you currently have access to. Every joint account, every investment account, the mortgage balance, his retirement fund, any business accounts, if there are any. Go through your shared finances completely and take screenshots of every balance, every statement, every transaction you can see. Save them somewhere he doesn't have access to. Do it tonight." I said, "Okay." She said, "I mean, tonight, not tomorrow." "Tonight," I said. "I understand." She gave me the name of a divorce attorney she trusted. She told me to call her first thing Monday morning. She told me not to discuss any of this with anyone else, not my sister, not my friends, not anyone, until I had spoken to the attorney. Then she said more quietly, I'm sorry. I know this is a lot to sit with. I said, "It's fine. I'll call you after I speak to her." I hung up and I opened every financial account we had. What I found that night, sitting at the desk in the small room we called the study, with the rest of the house quiet and Daniel asleep upstairs, was a picture I had not been looking for and could not now unsee. Our finances were not complicated. We had a joint checking account and a joint savings account. We each had individual retirement accounts. I had a brokerage account in my name from before we married. Daniel had a 401k through his employer. We had never hidden our finances from each other, or rather, I had never hidden mine, and I had assumed the same was true in reverse. The accounts were accessible to both of us. I simply had not been looking closely. When I looked closely, I saw it immediately. It had started 18 months earlier. Small transfers at first, $200 here, $300 there, always from the joint savings account, always to an external account I didn't recognize and couldn't access. The amounts were small enough to fall below the threshold of what either of us would notice in the ordinary course of monitoring our finances. We were not people who scrutinized every line of our accounts. We were people who glanced at balances and trusted that the overall picture was what it appeared to be. Over 18 months, using transfers small enough to seem like noise, Daniel had moved $43,000 out of our joint savings account and into an account I had no access to. $43,000. Quietly, patiently, a little at a time. The way you do something when you have decided it is necessary but cannot yet say so out loud. I documented everything. I took screenshots. I exported statements. I created a folder on a personal cloud account I had set up that evening specifically for this purpose. An account with an email address Daniel had never seen and a password he would never guess. I sent everything to Sarah. Then I closed the laptop, went to the kitchen, and made dinner. Something simple. Pasta. When Daniel came downstairs and said it smelled good, I said thank you. When he asked about my day, I told him about a meeting at work. When he laughed at something on television later that evening, I smiled. I was very calm. I want you to understand that. I was not performing calm. I was genuinely, almost frighteningly calm. Something had clarified inside me that evening. The confusion and the hurt were real, but underneath them something had settled into focus. I knew what I was dealing with. I knew what I needed to do. That knowledge, however painful its source, felt like solid ground under my feet. I went to sleep that night, and I slept without difficulty. On Monday morning, I called Margaret. Margaret had been practicing family law for 22 years. When I walked into her office that first time, a Wednesday, I had taken a long lunch. She was smaller than I expected. Compact, precise in her movements, she had the manner of someone who has heard a great many things and has long since stopped being surprised by any of them. I sat across from her desk and I told her everything I knew. I told her about the credit card statement, about the law firm charges, about the $43,000, about the 18 months of transfers. I told her calmly, in order, the way I had told Sarah. She listened without interrupting. She made notes. When I finished, she looked at her notepad for a moment, and then she looked at me. She said, "What you're describing, the systematic transfer of marital assets prior to initiating divorce proceedings, has a legal name. It's called dissipation of marital assets. In this state, it is considered by the court when determining property division. The documentation you've already gathered is valuable. The fact that you have 18 months of transfer history is very significant." I asked her what I should do. She said, "Nothing. That's the most important thing I can tell you right now. Do not confront him. Do not move money. Do not change your behavior in any way. Do not consult any of your mutual friends or family. Continue documenting anything new that you discover, and let me do my job." She said, "Waiting is a strategy. In situations like this, it is often the most powerful one available to you." I said, "I can wait." She looked at me for a moment in a way that I think was an assessment, the way someone experienced in human behavior looks at a person to judge whether they are telling the truth about themselves. Then she nodded and said, "Good. Then we're going to be fine." February arrived. Daniel opened the separate bank account on a Thursday. I know this because we shared a password manager, a small application on our home computer that stored login credentials for our various accounts. We had set it up together 3 years earlier for convenience. It had never occurred to him, apparently, that I still had access to it. Or perhaps it had occurred to him, and he had decided the risk was small. The email confirmation for the new account came to his personal email. I saw it because his personal email was also stored in the password manager. I did not read the full email. I didn't need to. The subject line, the sender, and the account number were sufficient. I forwarded a screenshot to Margaret, and I deleted the screenshot from my sent folder. Then I made coffee, and I watched the birds at the feeder outside the kitchen window for a while before getting ready for work. Daniel came downstairs while I was still in the kitchen. He poured himself coffee. He said something about the weather. I said something back. He left for work at his usual time. The morning was entirely ordinary. In March, the transfers accelerated. He had been moving small amounts, 200, 300, occasionally 500, for 18 months. In March, he moved $15,000 in a single transfer. I noticed it the same day it happened. I was checking the joint account balance on my phone during my lunch break, something I had begun doing daily since January, and I saw it immediately. The balance was $15,000 lower than it had been that morning. I sat in my car in the parking garage near my office, and I looked at that number for a long time. 15,000 in one day meant something had changed in his timeline. He was no longer pacing himself for concealment. He was preparing for an endpoint. I called Margaret from the parking garage. She already knew. She had set up account alerts on her end. She told me this was a positive development from a legal standpoint. She told me the larger transfer would be even more clearly documented as intentional dissipation. She told me to continue waiting. I said, "How much longer do you think?" She said, "Based on the pattern, I would estimate he moves in the next 2 to 4 months. Once people reach this stage, a separate account, a lawyer, an accelerated transfer schedule, they typically set a date and move toward it." I said, "Okay." She said, "You're doing everything right." I drove back to the office. I had a 2:00 meeting. I was on time for it. April brought the apartment. I found it by accident. Or rather, I found it in the way that things reveal themselves when you are paying attention to everything. Our home computer was in the study, and we both used it occasionally, though we each had our own work laptops. I was looking for a document I had saved there when I noticed the browser history had not been cleared. This was unusual. Daniel was careful about his browser history. He had been clearing it regularly since at least January. I had noticed its consistent emptiness and noted it without remarking on it, but he had apparently forgotten this particular session. I scrolled through it carefully. There was an apartment listing website. There was a specific listing, a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood about 20 minutes from our house and toward the city. I clicked through to it, available June 1st. 1,200 square feet, a small balcony. The photos showed a clean, neutral space. The kind of apartment that is ready to become whatever its next tenant needs it to be. I took a photograph of the screen with my phone. I sat in the study chair for a moment, looking at those rooms, the empty kitchen, the bedroom with its large window, the balcony overlooking a street I had never been on. I thought, he has been inside those rooms already in his imagination for months. He has been living a different life in his mind while living this one in this house, while sitting across from me at our table, while sleeping in our bed, while reaching over on the drive home from his sister's birthday dinner and squeezing my hand. I sent the photograph to Margaret, then I cleared the browser history, as he had intended to do and forgotten. I want to tell you about the birthday dinner, because it is part of the story that I have thought about many times since. It was in March. Caroline, Daniel's younger sister, was turning 30. The family gathered at his parents' house. His parents, his sister, her boyfriend, an aunt who always arrived early and left late, and Daniel and me. I had attended 9 of Caroline's birthdays. I knew where the good glasses were kept. I knew that Patricia, Daniel's mother, liked to be complimented on whatever she was serving, and that the compliment should be specific. Not just, "This is delicious," but "This sauce, specifically, is incredible." I knew that Daniel's father preferred to talk about sports and work and would grow visibly restless if the conversation turned emotional. I knew these people. I had believed for 11 years that I was part of their family. At the birthday dinner, I noticed something I had not noticed before. Patricia looked at me differently than she used to. It was subtle. It was the kind of thing you might not notice if you were not already paying attention to everything. But I was paying attention to everything, and I noticed it, a particular quality of careful warmth. The warmth you offer to someone you know you are going to have to stop being warm too soon. The specific politeness of someone managing their behavior in a temporary situation. She knew. I was certain of it. Not because of anything she said or did that could be pointed to directly, but because I had been studying people carefully for 3 months by then, and I knew what I was looking at. At some point in the months before January, perhaps when Daniel first went to the law firm, perhaps earlier, he had told his mother, or she had guessed, or he had let something slip. Whatever the mechanism, she knew that her son was planning to leave me, and she was being kind in the careful, managed way that you are kind to someone you are about to lose contact with. I helped clear the plates after dinner. I complimented the sauce. Specifically, the sauce. I talked to the aunt about her garden. On the drive home, Daniel reached over and squeezed my hand and said, "You were wonderful tonight." I said, "Thank you." I looked out the window, at the passing lights, and I thought about Patricia's eyes across the dinner table. I thought about the 11 years I had believed I was part of something. I thought about how a family can decide something about you before you even know the decision is being made. And then I thought, it doesn't matter. None of it matters except what is documented and what Margaret can use. I looked out the window until we got home. May was the hardest month. Not because anything new was discovered, not because anything changed in the legal strategy. May was hard because of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when I came home from work early. A meeting had been canceled at the last minute. And I found Daniel on the phone in the backyard. He didn't hear me come in. The back door was closed, but it was a warm day and the kitchen window was slightly open. I set my bag down on the counter and stood very still. I could see him through the glass. He was pacing a small circuit back and forth along the edge of the patio, and his free hand was moving the way it moved when he was engaged in a conversation he cared about. He looked animated in a way I hadn't seen him look in months. I couldn't hear everything. The words came in fragments through the partially open window. "She doesn't suspect anything," and then something I couldn't make out. I know, just a few more weeks, and then, I'll handle it." I stepped back from the window. I walked upstairs very quietly. I went to our bedroom, and I sat on the edge of the bed, the same edge where I had sat in January, when this had just begun. And I allowed myself, for the first time in 4 months, to feel the full weight of what was happening. 4 months. 4 months of ordinary mornings and shared dinners and functioning normally inside a life that was being disassembled around me without my knowledge or consent. 4 months of being the person in the room who knows the most and says the least. 11 years of a marriage, the house we had bought together, Biscuit, who didn't understand any of it and never would, the life I thought I had. I sat with all of that for 20 minutes, I want to be precise about the time because it was a conscious decision. I gave myself 20 minutes to feel it completely, to not push it away or manage it or translate it into a task. I sat on the edge of our bed in the afternoon light, and I let it be exactly as painful as it was. At the end of 20 minutes, I went to the bathroom and washed my face with cold water. Then I went downstairs and I started making dinner. And when Daniel came inside and said he'd been on a work call, I said that was fine and asked if he was hungry. He said he was starving. I said dinner would be ready in half an hour. Waiting is a strategy. I want to say more about this because I think it is one of the things people misunderstand when they hear a story like mine. There is a version of this story where the right thing to do, the emotionally honest thing, the brave thing, is to confront, to say what you know the moment you know it, to demand answers, to refuse to participate in the pretense, to insist on being treated like someone whose time and feelings matter. I understand that version. I do not think it is wrong. For some people, in some situations, confrontation is the right tool. It clears the air, it forces honesty, it refuses to enable deception by participating in a fiction. But here is what I learned in those 6 months. Confrontation, in my situation, would have cost me significantly. If I had walked into the backyard in May and said, I know about the lawyer and the bank account and the apartment, what would have happened? Daniel would have been surprised. He would have felt caught. And then within 24 hours, he and his attorney would have begun to adjust their strategy. The documented evidence of asset dissipation is most powerful when it is complete. When you can show a court 18 months of systematic transfers, not 3 months, not 6, but the full 18, the picture it creates is unambiguous. It demonstrates intention. It demonstrates planning. It demonstrates that this was not impulsive decision made in a moment of marital breakdown, but a deliberate, extended effort to position one party at a disadvantage before the other even knew the game had started. Every month I waited, the documentation grew stronger. Every month I waited, Margaret's file grew thicker. Every month I waited, the legal position I would walk into that eventual courtroom or settlement negotiation with became more solid, and so I waited. Not because I was passive, not because I was afraid, not because I didn't know what was happening or couldn't name what it was. I waited because it was the right move. June arrived, and with it the certainty that things were about to end. Margaret had told me that people in Daniel's position, with an apartment ready, a lawyer retained, a financial cushion built, typically move within 60 to 90 days of that point. We were at 90 days from when I had found the apartment listing. I had been watching the calendar in the way you watch a forecast, not with dread exactly, but with the particular alertness of someone who knows weather is coming and wants to be prepared when it arrives. The week before it happened, Margaret and I had a final check-in call. She walked me through exactly what we had and what she could do with it. She told me we were in an exceptionally strong position. She said it in the understated way that experienced attorneys say things they feel confident about. Not triumphant, just certain. She told me that earlier in the week. Based on her own intelligence about opposing counsel's preparations, she believed Daniel's attorney was preparing to file. She told me to be ready for a conversation at any time. I said, I'm ready. The Friday before the Saturday, I went to work, and I had an ordinary day, and I came home and made dinner and watched something on television and went to bed. I lay in the dark for a while, listening to Daniel breathe on the other side of the bed, and I thought, tomorrow, or the day after, or some morning very soon, he is going to sit me down and he is going to say the words. And I have been waiting for those words since January, and I am ready for them. Then I fell asleep. He chose Saturday morning. I woke before he did, which was not unusual. I lay in bed for a while, watching the light come through the curtains. Biscuit stirred at the foot of the bed and then settled again. The house was quiet in the particular way it is quiet on weekend mornings, a different quality of quiet than weekdays, softer somehow, more complete. I got up. I went downstairs. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. I want you to picture this moment, because it is the moment everything I had done for 6 months was pointing toward. A woman sitting at her kitchen table on a Saturday morning in late June with a cup of coffee, waiting, not anxiously. I was past anxiety, with the particular stillness that comes from knowing, from being prepared, from having done every single thing that could be done and having done it correctly. I sat there and I drank my coffee and I waited. When I heard Daniel's footsteps on the stairs, I set down my cup. He came into the kitchen. He was wearing the expression I had been watching him build for months, the practiced regret, the careful, performed sadness of a man who wants to leave but needs to believe, and needs you to believe, that he is the one who is suffering, that he is doing something hard, that he is, despite all evidence, the reluctant one. He poured himself coffee. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table. He said, "I need to talk to you about something." I said, "Okay." And then he talked. I will not give you every word because most of what he said was not actually about me or him or our marriage. It was about the idea of a marriage, the concept of growing apart, the philosophy of needing different things, the language of a man who has been coached on what to say and how to say it to minimize conflict and maximize sympathy. There was mention of still caring about me deeply. There was mention of always wanting what was best for me. At one point, he used the phrase, "This isn't working for either of us," which was a particular kind of revision of reality that I found impressive in its audacity, given that it had been working perfectly well for me until the moment I discovered he had been quietly dismantling it. He talked for about 8 minutes. When he finished, there was a silence. I looked at him across the kitchen table. This man I'd married at 26, this man I'd made a life with for 11 years, this man who had reached over and squeezed my hand on a drive home in March while knowing everything he knew. And I felt something that I still find difficult to name precisely. Not anger, not grief. Something quieter than both. A kind of vast, clear calm. I set down my coffee cup. I said, "I know." The expression on his face changed. It happened quickly. A flicker. A collapse of the practiced composure. Something almost like fear moving behind his eyes. He said, "What?" I said, I've known since January. I found the statement from the law firm in the filing cabinet on the first Saturday of the new year. I recognized the name. I looked them up. I've been working with my own attorney since the second week of January, a woman named Margaret who has been practicing family law for 22 years, and who is, I have come to believe, exceptionally good at her job. He didn't say anything. I said, "I have documentation of every transfer you made from our joint savings account going back 20 months. Margaret has a complete record. I have the email confirmation for the bank account you opened in February. We shared a password manager, which I think you forgot about. I have a photograph of the apartment listing that was in the browser history in April. I have records of the 2 visits to the law firm in November and December. I have everything, Daniel, organized and in the hands of someone who knows exactly what to do with it." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a car went by. Biscuit's nails clicked on the floor down the hall, and then he appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked at us both, and then walked over and lay down near my feet. I said, "I also want you to know that last week, with Margaret's guidance and at her recommended timing, I removed my name from our joint savings account and transferred my portion to an account in my name. I have consulted a financial advisor about the retirement accounts and the brokerage account. I have spoken to a real estate attorney about the house." I picked up my coffee cup. I looked at him. I said, So when you say you hope we can be mature about this, yes, I agree completely. I have been prepared for a mature conversation since the second week of January. I'm glad you're ready to have it. He didn't respond for a very long time. When he did speak, his voice was different than it had been 8 minutes earlier. The performance was gone. What remained was something smaller. A man sitting at a kitchen table on a Saturday morning who had walked into a room expecting one thing and found another entirely. He said, "How long did you know?" I said, "Since the first week of January." He said quietly, "All of it?" I said, "Enough of it." He looked down at the table. He looked at his coffee cup. He looked at the window. He said finally, "I'm sorry." I thought about that for a moment, about what those words meant and what they were worth at this point, about whether they were for me or for himself. I said, "I know." Then I said, "Margaret is available Monday. I would recommend you speak to your attorney before then." The legal process that followed was long. I won't walk you through every step of it because this is not a story about law. It is a story about what happens before the law gets involved, in the months when one person knows and the other doesn't, when one person is preparing and the other believes they are ahead. What I will tell you is what mattered. The 20 months of documented transfers mattered enormously. Margaret presented them as exactly what they were: a systematic, intentional effort to move marital assets prior to disclosure of intent to divorce, conducted over an extended period in amounts calculated to avoid immediate detection. The $15,000 March transfer, the one that told me he was accelerating his timeline, was particularly significant. It demonstrated not just intention, but escalation. Daniel's attorney had been preparing since December. Margaret had been preparing since January. That 1 month, that single month of advantage, made a difference that cannot be overstated. We settled out of court. I kept the house. I kept Biscuit. The $43,000 that Daniel had moved over 20 months was addressed in the settlement in a way that was, to use Margaret's understated language, favorable to my position. The retirement accounts were divided appropriately, which is to say equitably, and with full accounting for the discrepancy his separate account had created. Daniel moved into his 2-bedroom apartment on June 1st, as he had planned. I stayed in the house. I finally started that garden I had been meaning to start for years. I don't know why it took a divorce to make me do it, but it did. That first summer, I planted tomatoes and herbs and something called a climbing rose that took over the back fence by the following year, and which I love unreasonably. Biscuit learned where the garden was and to respect its borders, mostly. People ask me when I tell the story how I did it, how I functioned, how I sat across from him at dinner for 6 months, slept in the same bed, attended his sister's birthday party, and complimented his mother's sauce, and showed nothing. The honest answer is that I felt things, deeply and often. There were nights in those 6 months when the weight of what I knew settled on me so completely that I had to get up and sit in the kitchen in the dark just to let it be present without having to perform normalcy around it. There were moments, the phone call in the backyard, the dinner in March, ordinary Tuesday evenings watching television as though everything was the same, when I felt something so close to grief that I didn't trust myself with it. But I had learned something in those 6 months that I didn't know I needed to learn, something I think a lot of people spend their whole lives not learning. Feeling something and acting on it are not the same thing. You can hold pain in one hand and strategy in the other, and you do not have to drop either one. You can feel the full weight of a betrayal. Really feel it, not push it away, not pretend it isn't there, and still make the clear-eyed, careful decisions that the situation requires. The 20 minutes I allowed myself in May, sitting on the edge of the bed, while Daniel's voice came through the kitchen window, that was real. That grief was real. I did not suppress it. I gave it exactly the space it needed and not 1 minute more. And then I washed my face and went downstairs. That is not coldness. I want to be clear about that. What I am describing is not coldness, and it is not the absence of feeling. It is the decision to not let feeling be the only thing. It is the decision to honor both what you feel and what you need to do, and to find the discipline to hold them separately when it matters. Silence is not weakness. Patience is not passivity. Knowing more than the person across from you and choosing the moment carefully, that is not manipulation. When someone has already decided to deceive you, protecting yourself with information and preparation is not a moral failure. It is the appropriate response to the situation you actually find yourself in, not the one you thought you were in. I am not telling you that my way is the only way. I am not telling you that waiting is always the right strategy, or that confrontation is always wrong, or that every marriage that ends in betrayal should end the way mine did. Every situation is different. Every person is different. I am telling you this when I walked into that kitchen on a Saturday morning in late June with my coffee cup and my 6 months of preparation and Margaret's name on speed dial. I was not a victim. I had been victimized. There is a difference and it matters. What had been done to me was real and it was wrong. But I was not sitting at that table as someone to whom things were happening. I was sitting there as someone who had decided in January that she was going to be the one in that room who was prepared. She doesn't stay silent. She doesn't stay broken. She rises. But sometimes, and I think this is the part that people don't always hear, sometimes rising looks quiet. Sometimes it looks like a Saturday morning with coffee and a calm voice and a very thorough attorney. Sometimes it looks like 6 months of ordinary dinners and weekend mornings and doing nothing that would alert the other person that you know everything, and have already made your moves. Sometimes the loudest thing you can do is say nothing and wait and be ready. If you are going through something right now, if any part of this story felt familiar in a way that sat in your chest while you listened, I want you to hear this. You are allowed to take your time. You are allowed to know things and sit with them before you act on them. You are allowed to be the person in the room who is more prepared than anyone expects. You are allowed to be smarter, more patient, more strategic, not because you are cold, not because you don't feel it, but because you have decided that feeling it is not the same as being destroyed by it. You are allowed to rise. And if you just needed to hear someone else's story tonight, if you needed the company of a woman who got through something and came out the other side, then I'm glad you're here. Subscribe. There are more stories where this one came from, and every single one of them ends the same way. She rises. New story every week. If this one stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below. I read everyone. Tell me what part of this story hit you the hardest. I want to know.